Hello everyone, my name is Ethan Gregoire, and today we will be having a discussion with Mr. Isaac Shure, a former iGEM team member of Tufts Synthetic Biology at the University of Tufts in Massachusetts. Mr. Shure, now a data scientist, has agreed to speak with us today about his experience with iGEM. Hello again, Mr. Shure. I'd like to thank you again for agreeing to be here today. Would you like to just jump right into it?
Yeah, absolutely.
For those out there who might not know, what is iGEM, Mr. Shore?
Yeah, so I would describe iGEM as essentially just a group or a organization that coordinates uh, competition between student-run genetic engineering teams and synthetic biology groups. Uh, so it's essentially just an open competition that any student-run research team can join to try to compete to create the best genetically engineered project.
I guess
Uh,
you could
yeah,
also consider it as a sort of science fair for university students.
that's one way of putting it. Yeah.
So, Mr. Shore, I'd like to ask you about your past. Where were you born? Where were you raised? And what inspired you towards biology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Los Angeles, California. Um, and I decided to go to Tufts specifically because, well, there were a lot of reasons, but one of them was that I loved the flexibility that they have in their undergraduate program. So, for example, in my case, I actually went in as an international relations major, and I switched to chemical engineering during my first year there, which most schools don't let you just do that. As I'm sure you know, a very different courses of study. But at Tufts, the engineering school and the School of Arts and Sciences are considered, you know, they're different schools, but you can transfer between them freely. And so I transferred to the School of Engineering after a couple of classes in international relations. I was like, you know what? No, screw this. This is too wishy-washy. I need some good hard science. I transferred to chemical engineering because of that. And as I studied as a chemical engineer, I quickly realized that both kind of my passion and the aspect of chemical engineering that I was the best at was the biological side. And really, as especially in chemical engineering, which it handles, um, process scale manufacturing, like biology and synthetic biology is, in my opinion, really like the future of a lot of chemical manufacturing. And I think that's a lot of not a very controversial opinion for, of course, I'm not trying to say that, traditional chemical processes are going away anytime soon, but with a lot of the recent advances in synthetic biology, so many chemical processes nowadays are just bioreactors churning out, some protein that's important. Um, so I was trying to, get more involved in that side of chemical engineering because in addition to, all the promise for the industry that it has, I think it's really cool. And I was like, yeah, it's, you can genetically engineer a bunch of bacteria to make whatever chemical you want. That's awesome. I want to get involved in that. Um, and so I was, trying to get involved in research. Um, but the truth is, part of what, and I don't want to, make this seem like iGEM is less than a real research group or whatever, but a big part of why I ended up going with iGEM was that my grades were not very good. And most of the professors I talked to were like, oh, why don't you focus on your studies and your grades and not worry about getting involved in research? It's probably going to be a distraction for you and make it harder for you to study. And they're probably right about that, but I really wanted to do research. So I kept, after a couple of rejections from professors with more formal traditional research groups, I found Aiden and Anna, and they were, recruiting students for their synthetic biology team. And I was like, ha, this is perfect. I don't need a professor to say that I should focus on my studies because I can just join this group of students and we'll work on a project ourselves. Um, And I have no regrets about that. As much as maybe I probably should have been focusing on my studies, I had a lot of fun and learned a lot working with the Tufts synthetic biology team. And yeah, I'd recommend it to anyone else as well.
Was iGEM your first experience in research?
Yeah, yeah, that was my first experience in, which is definitely I would recommend for most people to try to get experience in something like an iGEM team in addition to more of a formal research experience, just because it's um, by its nature, iGEM can be very unstructured, which can make it hard to learn some good practices in research. But um, at the same time, some people, for me, for example, I actually really respond very well to those kinds of unstructured environments where it's just kind of like, all right, here's all the tools of a genetic engineering laboratory, figure out something. It's like very chaotic, which if you like that, then iGEM can be a very good place for you.
So it seems like iGEM is a great place for students who are interested in research but don't know if they want to commit to that track yet. I'd like to ask you about what you learned and any useful takeaways from your time with iGEM.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've gotten like two or three different job interviews because of my iGEM experience. Within bio, obviously, as you mentioned, I didn't end up going through the biotech route for my personal career. But if that's something that's interesting to you, then iGEM can be a very great thing to have on your resume because it's number one, it's research experience, which most companies really do want to see some kind of extracurricular research experience on your resume. But in addition to that, it gives you the opportunity to lead a project and to create something which employers really value and really look for. And that can be a lot harder to do through a traditional research background, where you definitely can as well, depending on the PI you're working with. But with iGEM, there's a guarantee that if you want to make your own project and you want to, be the leader and you want to like create this and drive it through completion, you can, as long as you're, willing to do all the work required to make it happen, which is the trade-off, of course. But
Going
um,
back to the start of the club, um, how did you hear about it in the first place?
yeah, so I heard about it just at the Tufts Club Fair. I was just walking around looking at different clubs and all the usual stuff, and then I come across the Tufts Synthetic Biology Club. I was like, what the heck is Synthetic Biology Club? That doesn't make any sense. They're like, yeah, we're a research club. You can join us and you can do research in a lab. And I was like, what? That's crazy. Like, yeah, sign me up. Um, that sounds awesome. And that was basically it. I mean, they were at Tufts. Tufts is it's a university, but a fairly small university. So there wasn't much more of a process than that to join. And even later on, as we got bigger, we pretty much just accepted anyone who want. And of course, that may differ at different universities, where there may be more interest in an iGEM group. There might be more of a stringent selection process. But for us, it was kind of like anyone who wants to join can. And if you are willing to stick around for more than like one or two meetings of like sitting in a lab all day, then you're on the team. Like that's because we did actually have a lot of turnover. Like a lot of people would join because they're like, oh, this sounds super cool. And then after like one day of working in the lab, they're like, this is actually really boring. I don't like sitting at a bench for like 4 hours straight. Which is fair, it's not for everyone. Especially at a school like Tufts where it's, like I said, it's and I know that in Europe things tend to be a little different with regards to this, but like especially at a school like Tufts, college is the place where you find out if you want to be a biologist or not. And a lot of people come into the lab, and that's the first time in a lab, and they're like, "Oh, no, I wanted to be a philosophy major, actually." So, um, we had a few of those at iGEM, um, yeah. So I just like I said, we would accept pretty much anyone. And if you're willing to stick around, then you're on the team. And that was great for me. That was that I enjoyed that a lot, and it was great to work with Aiden and Nana and all the other wonderful team members that we had over the years, and yeah, make something of our own.
Yeah, that seems like a great incentive for students interested in research, being able to start a project with peers that they're interested in without the chicken and egg dilemma usually dealt with at formal research companies. The dilemma being you need the experience before the job, but you need the job for experience. The trade off for that, however, is the project is entirely student led. Mr. Shore, could you tell us about some of the hurdles your team went through as a student led project? Additionally, how did you come up with the idea for a biosensor?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were honestly a little bit struggling at the beginning to figure out what we were going to do. Because as I said before, the nature of iGEM is so broad that that's one of the great things about iGEM is its broadness. But because of that, creating a project for us at least was like, okay, we could do literally anything with biology. Like that's a pretty big field. Um, so I forget who it was, but I think it was Aiden had heard about like this um bacteria that produced an electric potential. Um and he was just like, this is cool and weird, like want to do something with this. And the Shunella onidensis was the bacteria for anyone who's curious. But um s- and so he was we were just, he just threw that out, like, no, not a specific project. He wasn't even saying we need to do this. He's just like, I read about this bacteria that's cool. Do you maybe want to do this? And someone else was like, oh, well, maybe we could do like look into using that for like power generation or something. Um, and I was like, well, I don't think power generation would work very well because you're going to be losing so much energy in the metabolism of the bacteria that like and that's we did actually look at some previous projects that had looked into power generation, kind of came to that same conclusion where they were like, well, it doesn't really work very well, but maybe for some very specific niche applications where for some reason it needs to be bacteria and not a solar panel or any other power source. And so I was like, okay, this power generation is cool, but it doesn't really have any practical applications. Um, and I was like, well, what about a biosensor? We could instead of using the electrical potential to create power, we could use it as an indicator of whatever, some specific chemical, like use an inducible promotion of the gene that one of the genes involved in this pathway that's producing an electrical potential. Um, and that seemed potentially to be a lot more applicable to other industries or fields, where you might, like for example, in wastewater treatment to like detect heavy metals. It seemed like a possibility. And actually, a lot of the uh, power generation applications that had been proposed at iGEM before. Oh, yeah, I should mention that. That was actually a big part of our research process, was that we were looking at past iGEM projects. You can look on the website and, just search for whatever. If you think you want to work with, specific bacteria, like, so that was great for our brainstorming process. And that helped us narrow it down a little bit. And like I said, kind of be like, oh, other people have tried this pathway and it didn't turn out so well. So maybe maybe if you're like, oh, it didn't turn out so well, we could maybe do it better. Or you could be like, maybe we should try a different approach, which is what we ended up going with.
So, in addition to that, I'd like to ask if you went back to redo the project, what is it that you would change?
Yeah. So I don't know if it says this on our website, but we actually never finished our biosensor. That of course is still a great experience for me. And like I said, when it comes to things like job applications or stuff, don't stress too much about that. Like in my case, I've been very upfront with every job I've interviewed with. I'm like, oh, by the way, we didn't finish. And I've still gotten plenty of offers from different companies. Um, Typically, what people are looking for is more your mentality and how you approach problems when you're applying to jobs and stuff like that. Or same with, um, graduate programs or any. As long as you can talk about what you did and what you've learned, that's often more valuable than having a specific end goal. Obviously, shoot for that end goal. Don't be like us. Actually, finish your projects, but um, at the end of the day, like you said, iGEM is, kind of like a science fair for college students, and it's great to have your finished project at the end of the science fair. But even if you don't win the science fair, the important thing is the lessons you learn and all that. Um, but so, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could have done differently or tried to. So in our case, one of the challenges of a biosensor that I would caution future groups to think about is because of the nature of a biosensor requiring both biological engineering and electrical engineering components, our project would have required the collaboration of two separate laboratories at Tufts. We were primarily working with the NIRE lab, which was a bioengineering laboratory, but when we got to the later stages of the project, we would have needed to then work with an electrical engineering laboratory to calibrate the biosensor and make sure it's working properly. And that adds an extra layer of organizational complexity that is possible to work with, but that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're creating your projects is could this be done in a single laboratory or will this require a collaboration between different laboratories? Because that's going to make it a lot harder. Um, but in addition to that, for us, a big factor was the COVID-19 pandemic, which happened in the middle of our projects, and that kind of made it a lot harder to continue progress. Um, and we did keep trying. Specifically, Aiden spent a lot of time in the laboratory, um, but it's hard for one person to just by themselves complete a project like that, especially in a COVID situation where you know, like our advisor with the NIRE lab, Trevor, is a great guy. He's working at he founded his own startup after graduating his PhD program. But he was working with us a lot. So he and Aiden would kind of be able to work together in the lab. No one else could help, like, no other undergraduates could come in because of the limits for the spacing. And then of course, Trevor and Aiden, when they're working in the lab, they have to be 6 feet apart from each other. So it's like really limits what you can do. But um yeah, so that's a so yeah, so the make sure try to keep your project focused in a single laboratory, try to avoid global pandemics, and also I would say try to make sure that you're utilizing the skills of every team member collaboratively. And because that is one of the things that we saw is that as when became just Aiden who was able to work in the lab, which again, not his fault. There was a pandemic, no one else was allowed in the lab. But it can very quickly become way too much for one person to do. And I remember he was actually very stressed during that time of like, all the pressure is on me to finish the project, and like, I got all this other stuff I need to do too, and it's not a good situation for anyone. And yeah, so just assuming there's no global health pandemic, trying to uh, work to make to delegate responsibilities and make sure that everyone is um, both learning from being in the lab and also helping contribute in those ways.
So it seems a large, diverse, and dedicated team is the way to go to combat member overturn and overdoing any workload. I'm also curious about anything you found personally exciting. Could you tell us about some of the things that you enjoyed during your time with iGEM?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. It's hard to pick one thing, I guess. I think for me it was just really great. I mean, like I said, I do kind of thrive in those chaotic environments, but for me, just being able to work with my peers and fellow undergraduates and work together to build something of our own was really rewarding, and I'd really encourage anyone to do the same. Um, yeah, if you have any interest in synthetic biology, go out there and make your own project. I find a lab that's willing to work with you, of course, because that is very helpful and important. But yeah, it's you can just come up with any project you want, anything you want to do, and convince a couple of your undergraduate friends to do it with you, and go out there and do it.
That's definitely something that I look forward to, assuming everything works out when forming our team. So, Mr. Shure, what are you up to today in your professional career?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I was working as a data scientist for a few years. Currently, I'm actually tomorrow I'm starting a new job at the California Science Center, which is a, a a science museum for kids, and I'll be doing mostly tech work for them. They're creating a new department to uh, build out software to help support the different museum exhibits and have everything working together. So I'm very much um, I'm trying to combine tech and science a little bit is my that's kind of my not really reflected directly in my iGEM experience, but I've also always been a programmer and data scientist and all that jazz. So that's for me that's the direction I ended up going is more like software in terms of what I actually do, but trying to incorporate at least the flavor of hard science where I can. Um, what-
That's awesome. I actually love science museums. Um, I've actually got a small pin collection from all the science museums I go to. Well, collection's an overstatement. There's only two. But science museums are a great way to introduce science to the public, bringing in more scientists and strengthening our field. But I'd also like to ask you, do you have anything planned for the future?
Yeah, well, right now I'm applying to grad schools. So uh, applying to a lot of different programs. A few in the biology space. We're looking at potentially bioinformatics. Which we'll see. I mean, that's um, I would recommend to anyone who is scientifically inclined and maybe wants to work in tech. I would recommend data science as a possible path, um, because it's if you like, working coding and all that and math in addition to your scientific background, because it's in my opinion, the most empirically minded form of computer science, where you take it's basically just applied statistics, where you take, large data sets and try to draw conclusions from them. You create your own experiments. It's a lot of fun. The problem with data science that you run into is that, especially in hard science applications, a lot of the stuff is very hard, especially in biology. So it's very difficult to do any meaningful bioinformatics work without a PhD, just because it's so challenging. A lot of the and like that's what you'll notice. A lot of the entry, like beginner projects that you do when you're learning data science, have nothing to do with biology or hard science. They're usually like predicting how many customers are going to come for a given day or something. It's a lot of great business applications, and there's a lot of great jobs out there for master's or even bachelor's level people. But the hard science, as it often is, turns out to be a lot harder. But I would definitely recommend, because I didn't know about data science when I started undergrad, and it turned out to be a great path for me as someone who likes coding and also likes um, uh, the scientific method and a little bit more of an experimental mindset. So I would just give a shout out to data science and machine learning, and as a possibility for a path to go. But other than that, I don't have any specific shout outs, and thank you for continue keeping the iGEM torch alive, and best of luck to you and all your teammates.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Shore, for speaking and for sharing your advice to us. I'd like to wish you the best on your endeavors, and of course, thank you a second time for the free knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the end of my discussion with Mr. Isaac Shore, former member of the iGEM team at Tufts University in Massachusetts, United States. I've reached out to a few other former members of the Tufts synthetic biology team and was able to get some other questions answered by Kenny Huang, who is the administrative director of the iGEM Tufts team. However, due to time constraints, he was only able to respond digitally, and so I'll leave our discussion in the comments for this video. Thank you for listening, and take care.